The bustling noise of Terminal B at Logan International Airport was suddenly interrupted by raised voices near Gate 17. What started as a routine boarding check would soon leave hundreds of passengers in tears, turning an ordinary Thursday morning into a moment that would be remembered across the nation. Little did anyone know that the elderly man being blocked from boarding his flight was about to change their lives forever. The familiar symphony of airport sounds filled the terminal. Luggage wheels clicking against polished floors, muffled, announcements echoing through speakers, and the constant hum of conversations blending together. Gate agent Sarah Mitchell stood at her post, her practiced smile hiding the fatigue from an already long morning shift. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun, her navy blue uniform pressed and professional, despite having been on her feet. Since 4 a.m., the morning rush at Boston's Logan International was in full swing, with business travelers clutching their coffee cups and families corralling excited children. Sarah had been working this same gate for 3 years now, and she prided herself on keeping flights running smoothly and on time. Flight 23117 to Chicago was scheduled for an 8:45 a.m. departure, and boarding had just begun for first-class passengers and those needing special assistance. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the rising sun cast long shadows across the terminal, creating a warm glow that contrasted with the crisp December air outside. Ground crews scurried around the Boeing 737, their fluorescent vests bright against the morning light. Inside, passengers lined up in their designated groups, smartphones in hand, ready with their boarding passes. Sarah noticed him immediately, an elderly man in a worn leather jacket, standing slightly apart from the other passengers. His silver hair was neatly combed, and he stood with remarkable posture despite his apparent age. What caught her attention wasn't his appearance so much as his behavior. While others crowded impatiently toward the gate, he remained still, almost statue-like, his weathered hands gripping a small, outdated carry-on bag. As the priority boarding announcement ended, the man approached the counter. His movement was deliberate, measured, as if each step required careful consideration. Sarah's trained eye noticed a slight favor to his left leg, though he seemed to be working hard to conceal it. When he reached the counter, he gave her a gentle smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Good morning, sir," Sarah greeted him with her usual professional warmth. "May I see your boarding pass and ID?" The man reached into his jacket pocket with slightly trembling hands and produced a crumpled piece of paper. "I'm afraid there might be a problem," he said softly, his voice carrying a hint of resignation. "I printed this last night, but I'm not sure if it's what you need." Sarah took the paper, her practiced fingers smoothing out the wrinkles. Her brow furrowed as she examined it. It wasn't a standard boarding pass, but rather a confirmation email printed on yellowed paper. The booking reference was outdated, from a completely different airline, dated several years ago. She glanced at her computer screen, quickly searching for his name in the day's passenger manifest. "I'm sorry, sir, but I'm not seeing your name on today's flight. This seems to be an old confirmation from 2019. Do you have an updated boarding pass?" She kept her voice low, conscious of the growing line behind him. The man's face fell slightly, though he maintained his dignified posture. I was sure I had the right one this time." His fingers drummed lightly on the counter, a subtle betrayal of his increasing anxiety. "You see, I need to get to Chicago today. It's very important." Sarah felt the weight of the growing line behind him, saw the impatient shifts of waiting passengers from the corner of her eye. But something about the man's demeanor, the quiet desperation in his voice, made her pause. She'd seen thousands of passengers, dealt with countless issues, but something about this situation felt different. "Let me see if I can help you sort this out," she offered, her fingers already moving across the keyboard. "Can I see your ID, please?" He reached into his pocket again, this time producing a military veteran's ID card. The plastic was worn, the photo faded, but still clear enough to make out his details. Thomas Anderson. The name read, with a service number partially obscured by years of wear. The morning light streaming through the terminal windows caught the silver dog tags hanging from his neck, previously hidden beneath his jacket. Sarah noticed. His hands were still trembling slightly as he handed over the ID, and now she could see that what she had initially taken for age-related tremors might be something else entirely. Behind him, the line of passengers continued to grow, their murmurs of impatience becoming more audible. A businessman checked his watch pointedly, while a young mother tried to quiet her fussy toddler. But Sarah remained focused on the task at hand, something in her gut telling her this was more than a simple boarding pass issue. Sarah's colleague, Mark Chen, approached from the adjacent gate, his experienced eyes quickly assessing the situation. Having worked at Logan for over 15 years, Mark had developed an intuition for potentially difficult situations, and something about this scene made him pause his routine morning checks. "Everything all right here, Sarah?" he asked quietly, positioning himself beside her at the counter. His presence wasn't intrusive, but rather a subtle reminder of protocol and procedure. Mark had seen countless passengers try to board with incorrect documentation, and experience had taught him that firmness mixed with kindness was usually the best approach. "Mr. Anderson here has an outdated booking," Sarah explained, her voice professional but tinged with concern. "I'm trying to find him in the system." She turned back to Thomas, who stood patiently, his dignity intact, despite the growing discomfort of the situation. "So do you have any other documentation? Perhaps an email confirmation or a current boarding pass on your phone?" Thomas's weathered hands patted his jacket pockets again, movements becoming slightly more agitated. I don't have one of those smartphones," he admitted, a hint of embarrassment coloring his voice. "But I know I need to be on this flight. You see, in Chicago." His voice trailed off, and for a moment his steady posture wavered. Mark stepped forward slightly, his stance shifting from observer to participant. "Sir, without proper documentation, we can't allow you to board. Those are TSA regulations. Perhaps we can help you book a new ticket?" His tone was gentle but firm, the voice of authority and procedure. The growing line of passengers behind Thomas had begun to stir restlessly. A young executive in a crisp suit cleared his throat loudly, checking his watch for the third time in as many minutes. A couple whispered to each other, gesturing subtly toward the hold-up at the counter. "I understand," Thomas replied, his voice barely above a whisper now. "But you don't understand. Today is—" His hands gripped the counter edge, knuckles whitening slightly. For a brief moment, his carefully maintained composure cracked, revealing something raw and vulnerable beneath. Sarah felt a growing unease. In her 3 years at the gate, she'd developed a sense for distinguishing between genuine cases and those trying to bend the rules. Something about Thomas's demeanor, the subtle shake in his hands, the way he kept glancing at the terminal windows, suggested this was more than a simple booking error. "Mark," she said quietly, turning to her colleague, "can you check something for me?" She pointed to her screen, where she'd pulled up Thomas's veteran ID information. Mark leaned in, his eyes scanning the details, and his expression shifted, almost imperceptibly. The morning sun had fully risen now, casting long shadows through the terminal windows. Outside, ground crews continued their choreographed dance around the aircraft, oblivious to the drama unfolding at the gate. The terminal's usual cacophony seemed to fade into the background as the situation at Gate 17 continued to develop. "Sir," Mark began, his tone shifting slightly, "could you step aside with me for a moment? I'd like to understand your situation better." He gestured to a quieter area near the window. away from the line of increasingly impatient passengers. Thomas hesitated, his eyes darting between the gate and the windows. "There isn't much time," he said, his voice carrying an edge of urgency that hadn't been there before. "The ceremony in Chicago. I can't miss it. Not again. Not this time." A flight attendant approached the counter, clipboard in hand, ready to begin her pre-boarding checks. She paused, sensing the tension in the air. Sarah gave her a subtle shake of the head, and the attendant stepped back, understanding that something unusual was unfolding. Mark placed a gentle hand on Thomas's shoulder, guiding him a few steps away from the counter. "Tell me about this ceremony," he said, his voice low and careful. "Why is today so important?" Morning light caught Thomas's face as he turned, illuminating eyes that suddenly seemed distant, focused on something far beyond the terminal walls. His military bearing, so evident in his posture, seemed to both strengthen and burden him in that moment. Behind them, Sarah began processing other passengers, but her attention remained partially focused on the conversation taking place by the window. She watched as Thomas reached into his worn carry-on, his hands trembling more noticeably now, and withdrew what appeared to be an old, creased photograph. The line of passengers continued to move forward, many now casting curious glances toward the elderly veteran and the gate agent by the window. The usual hurried atmosphere of morning departures had shifted, almost imperceptibly, as more people began to sense that something significant was occurring at Gate 17. The crumpled photograph in Thomas's trembling hands showed a group of young soldiers, their faces bright with youth and determination despite the mud and grime coating their uniforms. The image was faded, its corners worn smooth from years of handling, but the pride and brotherhood captured in that moment remained clear across the decades. "Charlie Company, 1968, Thomas said softly, his finger tracing over the faces in the photograph. "That's Jimmy there, and Steve, and—" His voice caught for a moment as he pointed to a young man in the center of the group, his arm slung casually around Thomas's younger self. "That's Michael Reynolds. We called him Mickey." Mark listened intently, his practiced efficiency momentarily forgotten as he watched Thomas's weathered fingers move across the photograph. The morning sunlight streaming through the terminal windows seemed to soften, casting a gentle glow over the two men as they stood slightly apart from the bustling crowd. "Mickey saved my life in the Mekong Delta," Thomas continued, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "We were pinned down, heavy fire coming from all directions. I took a hit in my left leg, couldn't move. The others thought I was done for, but Mickey—" He paused, swallowing hard. "Mickey came back for me, dragged me half a mile through that jungle, never let go even when the firing got worse." The noise of the terminal seemed to fade into the background as Thomas spoke, his words carrying the weight of memories long held close. A few nearby passengers had slowed their hurried pace, their attention caught by the elderly veteran's story. We made it home, most of us. But Mickey was never the same after Nam. The things we saw, the things we had to do. Thomas's voice trailed off, his eyes distant. He struggled, we all did. But Mickey took it harder than most. Started drinking, couldn't hold down a job. His family tried to help, but he pushed them away, said he didn't deserve their love, not after what he'd done. Mark noticed Sarah glancing over from the counter, her face showing concern, even as she continued processing other passengers. The line had thinned somewhat, but those remaining seemed less focused on their delays and more drawn to the scene unfolding by the window. I tried to stay in touch, but Mickey kept moving around, never staying in one place too long. Last I heard from him was 15 years ago. He called me in the middle of the night, talking about the war, about redemption, about making things right. Thomas's hands tightened around the photograph. The next morning they found him. His voice broke, and for a moment the strong military bearing faltered. The morning sun had climbed higher now, its rays creating long shadows across the terminal floor. Outside, the ground crews continued their work, the routine of airport operations, continuing unchanged, while inside, at Gate 17, time seemed to slow around Thomas's story. Yesterday, I received a call from a woman in Chicago. Said she was Mickey's daughter. Told me they're holding a ceremony today at the Veterans Memorial, dedicating a new wall with names of veterans who... He paused again, struggling to maintain his composure. Veterans who lost their battle after coming home. Mickey's name will be there, along with too many others. She asked if I could come, said Mickey would have wanted me there. A young woman, waiting in line, wiped tears from her eyes, no longer pretending not to listen. An elderly couple, seated nearby, held hands tightly, their own memories perhaps stirred by Thomas's words. Even the businessman who had been checking his watch now stood quietly, his earlier impatience forgotten. I tried to book a flight online at the library, Thomas continued, his voice steadying slightly. The librarian helped me, but I must have done something wrong. I couldn't figure out all those confirmation emails and digital tickets, but I had to try. I owe it to Mickey. He never left me behind, not in that jungle, not when everyone else had given up. I can't leave him behind now. Not for this. Mark reached for his radio, then hesitated, his years of airport procedure warring with the human drama unfolding before him. The morning light caught the silver dog tags around Thomas's neck, making them gleam briefly, a silent reminder of sacrifices made and bonds forged in the crucible of war. Through the terminal windows, the waiting aircraft stood ready, its engines still quiet, its destination a city where another veteran's story would be honored, another name added to the too long list of those who had carried their wars home with them. The ceremony would begin in just a few hours, with or without Thomas Anderson present to honor his fallen brother-in-arms. Mark turned back toward the counter, catching Sarah's eye with a subtle nod. She immediately understood, stepping away from her station and approaching them with purpose. The usual terminal chaos continued around them, but at Gate 17, a small pocket of reverent silence had formed, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. "Mr. Anderson," Sarah began, her voice carrying a new tone of determination, "I need to make a few calls. Can you wait here with my colleague for just a moment?" She didn't wait for his response before pulling out her phone and stepping a few paces away, her fingers moving quickly across the keypad. Thomas stood quietly, still holding the photograph, his thumb unconsciously brushing across the faded image of his young comrades. The morning light caught the moisture in his eyes, though. No tears fell. Years of military discipline held firm. Even now, around them, the atmosphere in the terminal had shifted. Passengers who moments ago had been impatiently checking their watches now stood in contemplative silence. A young mother whispered something to her curious child, her voice carrying words about heroes and sacrifice. The businessman, who had been so frustrated by the delay, now stood with his head slightly bowed, his own father's military photo perhaps flickering through his memory. Sarah's voice carried across the quiet space as she spoke urgently into her phone. "Yes, sir, that's right. A Vietnam veteran trying to reach Chicago for..." She turned away, her words becoming muffled, but her body language spoke of intense focus and determination. A flight attendant emerged from the jet bridge, clipboard in hand, ready to announce boarding. She paused, sensing the gravity of the moment, and waited silently by the counter. The plane outside gleamed in the morning sun, its destination now carrying a weight far beyond simple geography. Thomas's voice broke the silence, barely above a whisper. "I should go. I'm holding everyone up." He began to turn away, his shoulders squared despite the defeat in his voice. "Maybe I can find a bus, or..." "Sir." The businessman stepped forward, his earlier impatience replaced with quiet resolve. "Please, don't leave. Not yet. Others nodded in agreement, the crowd around Gate 17 now united in silent support of the elderly veteran in their midst. Sarah returned, her face flushed with purpose. "Mr. Anderson, I've spoken with my supervisor and the airline's regional manager." She paused, glancing at her computer screen, where new information was appearing. "They're making some arrangements, but I need to ask you a few questions." The terminal's usual announcements continued overhead, a strange counterpoint to the intimate drama unfolding at the gate. Outside, ground crew members moved with practiced efficiency, preparing for departure, while inside, time seemed to move at a different pace entirely. "When is the ceremony scheduled to begin?" Sarah asked, her fingers poised over her keyboard. "At 2 o'clock, Thomas replied, his voice stronger now. "At the Veterans Memorial Plaza. Mickey's daughter said they're gathering at 1:30. He hesitated, then added softly, "She said she'd wait for me if she could, but the ceremony has to start on time. Protocol, you understand?" Sarah nodded, typing quickly. "And do you have someone meeting you at O'Hare? Any arrangements for getting to the memorial?" Thomas shook his head. "I thought I'd find a taxi, or maybe the subway if they still have those in Chicago. I haven't been there since." His voice trailed off, memories of another time, another homecoming perhaps crossing his mind. The morning sun had risen higher, its rays now streaming directly through the terminal windows, creating long shadows that stretched across the floor like reaching fingers. Outside, the aircraft stood ready, its purpose now transformed from simple transportation to something more profound, a vehicle of memory and honor. Mark's radio crackled to life, and he stepped away to respond, his voice low and urgent. More airline staff had gathered at the counter, their faces showing unusual emotion for typically stoic airport employees. Something was happening. Plans being made, protocols being rewritten in real time. Through it all, Thomas stood quietly, the photograph still in his hands, his posture straight, despite the weight of years and memories. The dog, tags around his neck, caught the light occasionally, silent witnesses to both past and present, to promises made and kept across decades of peace and turmoil. The crowd around Gate 17 had grown, with passing passengers stopping to witness the unfolding scene. There was something in the air, a sense that they were all part of something larger than themselves, something that transcended the usual hurry and stress of air travel. Sarah returned to the counter with renewed purpose, her movements quick and deliberate. The computer screen before her displayed a flurry of new information, special codes, and authorizations filling the previously empty fields. Behind her, Mark was still on his radio, his face breaking into the first genuine smile of the morning. "Mr. Anderson," Sarah called, her voice carrying a note of triumph. "We've made some arrangements." She gestured for him to approach the counter, and the crowd of passengers parted naturally, creating a path for the elderly veteran. The morning sun caught his silver hair as he moved forward, his slight limp more pronounced now that he had been standing for so long. "The airline's regional director has authorized a special boarding pass for you," she continued, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "We're also upgrading you to first class, and—" She paused, glancing at her screen as new information appeared. "It appears someone has taken care of your fare." Thomas's eyes widened slightly. "I don't understand. Who would—" He looked around, confusion evident on his weathered face. The businessman who had been so impatient earlier stepped forward, straightening his tie with slightly trembling hands. "My father was in Vietnam," he said, his voice carrying across the now quiet gate area. "2nd Battalion, 5th Marines. He never talked about it much, but I know he carried it with him every day until he passed." He cleared his throat. "Let me do this, sir. Please." Before Thomas could respond, another voice spoke up from the crowd. "I want to help, too." A young woman in medical scrubs pushed forward. "My brother served in Afghanistan. He made it home, but some of his friends didn't. Not really, not all the way. Her voice cracked slightly. "Let me contribute to the fare." More voices joined in, a chorus of offered assistance and shared stories. A retired teacher mentioned her uncle who served in the Air Force. A college student spoke of her grandmother, who was a nurse in the field hospitals. Each voice carried its own connection to service, to sacrifice, to the complex web of military experience that touched so many American families. Sarah watched as her computer screen updated with multiple payment notifications, her vision blurring slightly with unexpected tears. Mark returned to the counter, his radio silent now, and began preparing the special boarding documents. The flight attendant, who had been waiting to begin boarding, stood quietly, her own eyes glistening as she witnessed the spontaneous outpouring of support. I can't accept all this," Thomas protested, his military bearing wavering under the weight of the moment. "It's too much. You all have your own travels, your own needs." An elderly woman seated nearby spoke up, her voice gentle but firm. "Young man," she said, causing Thomas to turn toward her with surprise at being addressed as young man after so many years. "My Harold served in Korea. He always said that the hardest part wasn't what they did over there, but what they carried when they came home. Let us help you honor your friend. Let us help you keep your promise." The terminal's usual sound seemed muted now, as if the whole building was holding its breath. Outside, the morning sun had reached its full strength, bathing the gate area in warm light. The aircraft waited patiently, its purpose now transformed, from mere transportation to a vessel of memory and honor. Sarah's printer hummed to life, producing a pristine boarding pass. She lifted it carefully, as if handling something precious. "Mr. Anderson," she said, her professional demeanor temporarily cracking with emotion, "you're confirmed on Flight 2317 to Chicago O'Hare, first class, seat 2A. She paused, composing herself. "And there's something else." Mark stepped forward, holding his radio. "We've arranged for assistance at O'Hare, sir. A Veterans Support Coordinator will meet you at the gate. They're arranging transportation to the memorial." He smiled slightly. "Apparently there are quite a few people in Chicago who want to help make sure you make it to that ceremony on time." Thomas stood motionless, the boarding pass in his hands, his eyes fixed on the simple piece of paper that represented so much more than just a flight ticket. The photograph of Charlie Company was still visible in his shirt pocket, the edges worn, but the memories it contained as sharp as ever. The crowd around Gate 17 remained silent, united in their witness of this unexpected moment of grace. The businessman who had started the chain of generosity stood quietly, his earlier hurry forgotten. The young mother held her child close, whispering something about heroes and kindness. Even the usual bustle of the terminal seemed to move more, softly, as if conscious of the sacred space that had been created in this most unlikely of places. The boarding process began with a solemnity rarely seen at an airport gate. Thomas Anderson was helped down the jet bridge first, Mark walking beside him, matching his pace to the elderly veteran's measured steps. The other passengers followed at a respectful distance, their earlier rush forgotten in the wake of what they had witnessed. Inside the aircraft, the flight crew had been briefed about their special passenger. The lead flight attendant, Jennifer Torres, met Thomas at the door with a warmth that went beyond professional courtesy. Her own father had served, she explained softly, as she guided him to his first-class seat. Her gentle efficiency spoke of understanding beyond mere customer service. "Mr. Anderson," Jennifer said, helping him stow his small carry-on bag, "I've informed the captain about your situation. He'd like to speak with you once we're airborne, if that's all right." She adjusted his seat slightly, ensuring his injured leg would have adequate room. He served as well. Thomas settled into the wide leather seat, looking almost lost in its luxury. His weathered hands rested on the armrests, the contrast between his worn jacket and the plush surroundings stark, but somehow fitting. The morning sun streamed through the window beside him, warming the space with golden light. As other passengers boarded, many paused briefly at his row, offering quiet words of respect or simple nods of acknowledgement. The businessman who had first offered to pay took his own seat further back in the cabin, but not before placing a gentle hand on Thomas's shoulder, a gesture that spoke volumes in its simplicity. The usual pre-flight announcements began, but they seemed different somehow, infused with an unusual gravity. Jennifer's voice carried a special warmth as she welcomed everyone aboard Flight 2317 to Chicago. The safety demonstration, often ignored by frequent flyers, received respectful attention from the entire cabin. As the aircraft pushed back from the gate, Thomas gazed out the window at the terminal where, just an hour ago, he had stood with little hope of making it to Chicago. His reflection in the glass showed a man transformed not by the unexpected turn of events, but by the realization that his mission to honor Mickey had touched so many hearts. The engines rumbled to life, their powerful thrust building as the plane taxied toward the runway. Thomas felt the vibrations through his seat, reminding him of other journeys, other aircraft, in a time when he and Mickey were young men serving their country. His hand unconsciously moved to the photograph in his pocket, touching it like a talisman. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice came over the intercom, carrying the clear, precise tone of a military background. "This is Captain Robert Hayes speaking. We're number 1 for takeoff, and our flight time to Chicago will be 2 hours and 15 minutes. The weather in Chicago is clear, temperature 52 degrees, perfect conditions for arrival." There was a pause, and when the captain spoke again, his voice carried a different note. "I'd also like to acknowledge that we have the honor of carrying a very special passenger today, a Vietnam veteran on an important mission of remembrance. Sir, we're privileged to help you on your journey." The aircraft aligned with the runway, power building in the engines. Thomas felt the familiar surge of acceleration, the pressure pushing him back into his seat as the plane raced down the runway. As they lifted off, Boston falling away beneath them, he noticed Jennifer discreetly wiping her eyes while securing the galley for takeoff. The plane climbed steadily through the morning sky, banking gently as it turned westward toward Chicago. Thomas watched the landscape below transform from city to countryside, each mile bringing him closer to his final promise to Mickey. The photograph in his pocket seemed to carry an extra weight now, a tangible link between past and present, between promises made and promises kept. Once they reached cruising altitude, Jennifer appeared with a cup of coffee, served in a proper china cup. "The captain will be out to speak with you shortly," she said, arranging the cup and saucer on his tray table. "Can I bring you anything else? Something to eat, perhaps?" Thomas shook his head, managing a small smile. "This is more than enough, thank you, more than I ever expected." His voice carried the weight of the morning's events, of decades of memories, of a friendship that had survived war and continued beyond death itself. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and soon the captain emerged from the cockpit, his uniform crisp and professional. He approached Thomas's seat with the measured steps of someone who understood the significance of the moment. In the captain's bearing, Thomas recognized the familiar posture of a fellow serviceman. Through the window, the morning sun continued to track their journey westward, its light catching the wings of the aircraft as it carried its precious cargo of memories, promises, and unexpected grace toward a ceremony where past and present would meet in a final salute to a fallen brother. Captain Hayes stood by Thomas's seat, his posture straight but relaxed. "Mind if I join you for a moment, sir?" he asked, gesturing to the empty seat across the aisle. The morning sun streaming through the windows cast long shadows across the cabin as Thomas nodded his assent. "I was Army aviation," the captain said softly, settling into the seat. "3 tours in Afghanistan, Different war, same brotherhood. He paused, his eyes showing understanding that went beyond words. Jennifer told me about your friend Mickey. About the ceremony today. Thomas turned slightly in his seat, facing the captain. The photograph from his pocket now lay on his tray table, its edges catching the sunlight. Charlie Company, he said, his voice steady. Mickey was our radio man. Best damn radio man in the whole unit. Kept us connected when everything else was falling apart. The captain leaned forward slightly, his eyes taking in the faded image of young soldiers standing together, their faces showing a mix of bravado and innocence that war would soon alter forever. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the photograph. Thomas nodded, and the captain handled the precious memory with reverent care. "That's Mickey there." Thomas pointed to the young soldier in the center. "Always had a joke ready, even in the worst moments. Kept our spirits up when things got dark. But after we came home..." His voice trailed off, the unspoken weight of post-war struggles hanging in the air between them. The captain nodded, understanding written across his features. "We lose too many after they come home," he said quietly. "Sometimes the hardest battles are fought in silence, long after the guns. Go quiet." He carefully returned the photograph to Thomas. Jennifer appeared with fresh coffee for both men, her movements deliberate and respectful of the moment they were sharing. The usual cabin noise seemed muted, as if the other passengers instinctively recognized the sacred space of shared service and sacrifice being honored in first class. "Sir," Captain Hayes continued, "I've arranged for a priority approach into O'Hare. We'll be landing ahead of schedule." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "And there's something else. Word of your journey has spread. There's a group of veterans waiting at the terminal in Chicago. They want to provide escort to the memorial." Thomas's hands tightened slightly on his armrests, emotion threatening to break through his composed exterior. "You didn't have to do all this," he managed to say. "I'm just trying to keep a promise to an old friend." "No, sir," the captain replied firmly. "We didn't have to. We needed to. Every veteran who makes it home carries the weight of those who didn't, whether they fell in combat or after. What you're doing today, honoring Mickey's memory, that matters. It matters to all of us who served." The plane cruised steadily westward, the landscape below a patchwork of fields and forests. In the cabin, other passengers occasionally glanced toward the two men, sensing the importance of their quiet conversation, but respectfully maintaining their distance. "I've got something for you," Captain Hayes said, reaching into his uniform pocket. He withdrew a small pin, pilot's wings, gleaming gold against his palm. "These were my first pair from flight school. I'd be honored if you'd wear them today." At the ceremony, Thomas stared at the offered wings, their significance not lost on him. With slightly trembling hands, he accepted them, holding them carefully as if they might disappear. "Captain, I can't—" "You can," Hayes interrupted gently. "And you will, because today you're not just representing yourself or Mickey. You're representing all of us who understand what it means to serve, to lose brothers, to carry their memory." He stood, straightening his uniform. "We'll be starting our descent in about an hour. I'll make sure you have plenty of time to make." The ceremony. As the captain returned to the cockpit, Thomas carefully pinned the wings to his jacket lapel, opposite from where his own service ribbons would have been if he were in uniform. Jennifer appeared again, this time with a warm cloth for his hands and a fresh cup of coffee. The businessman who had helped pay for his ticket passed by on his way to the lavatory, pausing briefly. "Sir," he said softly, "my father would have been proud to be on this flight with you." Then he continued on, leaving Thomas to his thoughts. Through the window, the sun continued its arc across the sky, marking the passage of time as the aircraft carried its precious cargo of memories and promises toward Chicago. Below, the landscape gradually changed, the rural fields giving way to the first signs of suburban development as they approached their destination. In the quiet of the first-class cabin, Thomas Anderson sat straight in his seat, the captain's wings catching the light on his lapel, Mickey's photograph safe in his pocket, while memories of jungle heat, brotherhood, and promises made half a century ago mingled with the unexpected grace of this morning's events at Logan International. The descent into O'Hare International began with unusual smoothness, Captain Hayes handling the controls with extra care. The Chicago skyline appeared on the horizon, its towers piercing through the afternoon haze. Thomas watched through his window as the sprawling city grew closer, each passing moment bringing him nearer to his final tribute to Mickey. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jennifer's voice came over the intercom, carrying a subtle note of emotion. "We're beginning our final approach into Chicago O'Hare International Airport. Local time is 12:15 p.m., and the temperature is a comfortable 54 degrees. We've been granted priority landing clearance, and we should be at the gate in approximately 20 minutes. The aircraft banked gently, aligning with the runway. Thomas felt the familiar sensation of descent, but this time it carried a weight of anticipation he hadn't experienced since his service days. The captain's wings on his lapel caught the sunlight, a reminder of the unexpected brotherhood he'd found. On this journey, as they descended, Thomas could make out the massive expanse of O'Hare, its runways stretching like concrete ribbons across the landscape. Somewhere in this city, Mickey's daughter was waiting, preparing to honor her father's memory. The thought made his throat tighten with emotion. The landing was exceptionally gentle, drawing appreciative murmurs from the passengers. As they taxied toward the gate, Thomas noticed something unusual through his window, a line of people standing at attention on the tarmac. Even from this distance, he could see their military bearing, their uniform stance unmistakable. "Mr. Anderson," Jennifer appeared at his side, her voice soft but urgent. "The ground crew has requested that you remain seated after we arrive. They have some special arrangements for your deplaning." She paused, smiling gently. "It seems word of your journey has traveled faster than our aircraft." The plane came to a stop at the gate, and Captain Hayes's voice filled the cabin one final time. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Chicago. Before we begin deplaning, I ask for your patience as we assist our special passenger. And sir," his voice carried a note of respect that made Thomas's chest tighten, "it has been our highest honor to serve you today." As the seatbelt sign dinged off, the other passengers remained seated, a remarkable show of respect in an era of rushed departures. Jennifer helped Thomas gather his few belongings, carefully handling his worn carry-on bag while he secured Mickey's photograph in his jacket pocket. The aircraft door opened and a group of uniformed service members entered the cabin. Their uniforms gleamed under the cabin lights, medals and ribbons telling their own stories of service and sacrifice. The lead officer, a Marine Corps colonel, approached Thomas's seat. "Staff Sergeant Anderson," the colonel said, using Thomas's old rank with precision. "I'm Colonel James Martinez. Welcome to Chicago, sir. We're here to escort you to the Veterans Memorial Plaza." He extended his hand, which Thomas grasped firmly, fighting to maintain his composure. As Thomas stood, the entire cabin rose with him. The businessman who had helped pay for his ticket stood at attention, as did several other passengers who clearly had military backgrounds. Even those without military experience seemed to understand the gravity of the moment, standing in respectful silence. The walk through the aircraft was unlike any deplaning Thomas had ever experienced. Each passenger nodded or saluted as he passed, many with tears in their eyes. Jennifer stood at the aircraft door, her own eyes glistening as she gave him a formal salute, which Thomas returned with ingrained precision. Emerging from the jet bridge into the terminal, Thomas stopped short. The concourse was lined with people, veterans in uniform, airport staff and travelers, all standing in respectful attention. A path had been cleared through the crowd, lined by service members from all branches, standing at parade rest. "Staff Sergeant," Colonel Martinez said quietly, "your honor guard awaits. Shall we proceed?" Thomas straightened his shoulders, feeling the weight of Captain Hayes's wings on his lapel. The photograph of Charlie Company rested above his heart, and somewhere in the city, Mickey's name waited to be honored. He took a deep breath, nodded to the colonel, and began walking. The terminal fell silent except for the rhythmic sound of footsteps as Thomas and his escort moved through the crowd. American flags appeared, held by veterans who had gathered to support one of their own. A young girl in a Girl Scout uniform stepped forward, offering Thomas a single rose, which he accepted with trembling hands. Near the terminal exit, a small group of Vietnam veterans stood together, their aged faces showing the same mix of pride and pain that Thomas carried. As he approached, they snapped to attention, offering sharp salutes that spoke of bonds forged in jungle heat and battlefield chaos half a century ago. Outside, a line of police motorcycles waited, their lights flashing silently. A sleek, black vehicle, marked with military insignia, stood ready to transport Thomas to the ceremony. The afternoon sun caught the brass buttons and medals of the honor guard, creating a brilliant display of light and shadow. Colonel Martinez opened the vehicle's door, but before Thomas could enter, a voice called out from the crowd, "Staff Sergeant Anderson?" He turned to see Jennifer, the flight attendant, running toward him, holding something in her hands. It was a folded American flag, the kind presented at military funerals. "The captain wanted you to have this," she said breathlessly. "For Mickey." Thomas accepted the flag, holding it close to his chest, understanding the profound significance of the gesture. The weight of it in his arms felt right, felt necessary for the task ahead. The motorcade moved swiftly through the streets of Chicago, police escorts clearing the way with silent efficiency. Thomas sat in the back of the military vehicle, the folded flag resting in his lap, his thoughts drifting between past and present with each passing mile. Colonel Martinez sat beside him, maintaining a respectful silence that spoke of understanding. The city landscape blurred past the windows, modern glass towers giving way to older neighborhoods, each street bringing them closer to the veterans. Memorial Plaza. Thomas could feel Mickey's photograph in his pocket, a tangible link to promises made decades ago in a jungle halfway around the world. "Staff Sergeant," Colonel Martinez spoke softly, checking his watch. "We'll arrive in about 10 minutes. There's something you should know." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Word of your journey has spread. The ceremony, it's grown larger than originally planned." Through the tinted windows, Thomas began to notice people lining the streets. Some held flags, others stood at attention, and many raised their hands in salute as the motorcade passed. The afternoon sun caught the flash of medals on old uniforms, the gleam of newly polished service pins on civilian clothes. "Mickey's daughter, Sarah," the colonel continued. "She's been told about your arrival. She wanted to meet you privately before the ceremony, if you're comfortable with that." Thomas nodded, his throat too tight for words, his hands gripping. The folded flag a little tighter. The motorcade turned onto Memorial Drive, and Thomas's breath caught in his throat. The plaza stretched out before them, a sea of people gathered around the memorial walls. The new section, where Mickey's name would be inscribed, stood draped in ceremonial cloth, waiting to be unveiled. As the vehicle slowed to a stop, Thomas could see rows of chairs filled with families of veterans, active duty service members standing at parade rest, and civilians who had come to witness this moment of remembrance. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the plaza, creating a solemn atmosphere that matched the gravity of the occasion. A young woman stood waiting near the memorial wall, her posture suggesting both anticipation and nervousness. Her dark hair and determined chin reminded Thomas so much of Mickey that his heart skipped a beat. Sarah Reynolds had her father's eyes that widened with emotion as Thomas emerged from the vehicle. "Staff Sergeant Anderson?" Her voice wavered. Slightly as she approached, "I'm Sarah, Mickey's daughter." She stopped a few feet away, uncertainty visible on her face. "Dad, he used to talk about you on his good days, called you his guardian angel." Thomas stood frozen for a moment, the folded flag still cradled. In his arms, the captain's wings on his lapel caught the sunlight, and Mickey's photograph seemed to burn against his chest through his jacket pocket. "Your father," he managed to say, his voice rough with emotion. "He was the real hero. He saved my life." Sarah stepped forward then, closing the distance between them. Without hesitation, she wrapped her arms around the elderly veteran, embracing him as if he were the father she had lost too soon. "Thank you for coming," she whispered. "Thank you for remembering him." Behind them, the crowd maintained a respectful distance, but Thomas could feel their presence, their collective understanding of this moment's significance. Colonel Martinez stood nearby, coordinating quietly with other officials, ensuring everything was in place for the ceremony. "I have something," Thomas said, carefully reaching into his jacket pocket. He withdrew the worn photograph, holding it out to Sarah. "Your father, in Vietnam, Charlie Company." Sarah took the photograph with trembling hands, her fingers tracing her father's young face. "I've never seen this before," she said softly, studying the image of her father in his youth, surrounded by his brothers in arms. "He looks so alive." Her voice caught on the last word, understanding flowing between them about all that had been lost, not just in the war, but in the difficult years that followed. The sun continued its westward journey, casting golden light across the memorial plaza. Around them the crowd began to move, taking their places for the ceremony. The honor guard stood ready, their uniforms pristine, their dedication evident in every precise movement. "They're ready for us," Colonel Martinez approached gently. "Staff. Sergeant, you'll be seated with the family in the front row. Sarah, whenever you're ready." Thomas nodded, still holding the folded flag close, while Sarah carefully returned the photograph to him. As they walked toward their seats, Thomas felt the weight of every step, every mile that had brought him to this moment. From a desperate morning at Logan International to this sacred afternoon in Chicago, his promise to Mickey was finally being fulfilled, carried on the wings of unexpected kindness and enduring brotherhood. The ceremony began with the mournful notes of taps floating across the plaza, played by a lone bugler standing at attention near the memorial wall. Thomas sat beside Sarah, the folded flag resting across both their laps, a shared connection to the man they had both loved in different ways. The gathered crowd, now numbering in the hundreds, remained silent as the local Veterans Affairs Director stepped to the podium. His voice carried clearly across the plaza, speaking of sacrifice, of battles fought both abroad and at home, of warriors who survived the war only to face equally daunting challenges after their return. "Today," the director continued, "we dedicate this wall to those who carried their wars home with them, who fought battles long after leaving the battlefield. Their sacrifice, their struggle, their courage deserves to be remembered, alongside those who fell in combat." Thomas felt Sarah's hand grip his arm as the ceremonial cloth began to lower, revealing the newly carved names. The afternoon sun caught the polished surface, making each engraved letter shine like burnished gold. Somewhere in that list of names was Mickey Reynolds, his final resting place among his brothers in arms. A Marine Corps honor guard stepped forward, their movements precise and deliberate. The sharp report of their rifles cracked across the plaza. Once, twice, 3 times, the traditional salute to fallen comrades. Each shot seemed to echo through Thomas's memories, carrying him back to jungle paths and midnight watches. Staff. Sergeant Anderson, the director's voice drew him back to the present. Would you please step forward? Thomas rose slowly, his military bearing automatic despite his years. Sarah squeezed his hand once before letting go. Moving to the podium, Thomas faced the gathered crowd. He saw veterans young and old, families, holding each other close, children learning about sacrifice and honor through the power of this moment. The businessman from the flight stood near the back, his earlier rush forgotten in the solemnity of the ceremony. Mickey Reynolds saved my life in Vietnam, Thomas began, his voice steady despite the emotion building in his chest. But that wasn't the most important thing he did. Mickey taught us how to laugh when there was nothing to laugh about. He showed us how to hold on to our humanity when the world seemed determined to strip it away. The afternoon light softened, casting long shadows across the plaza as Thomas continued. When we came home, Mickey fought another war. A harder war in many ways. He battled demons that none of us could see, enemies that followed him from the jungle into his dreams. Sarah wiped tears from her eyes as Thomas spoke of her father, painting a picture of both the hero who had saved him in combat and the troubled soul who had struggled to find peace at home. The crowd listened in respectful silence, many nodding, in understanding of battles fought long after the guns fell silent. Today, Thomas's voice grew stronger, we honor Mickey and all those like him who brought their wars home, who fought with the same courage and dedication they showed on the battlefield, even when the enemy was within. They are our brothers and sisters, our heroes, and their names deserve to stand in honor. Colonel Martinez stepped forward then, leading Thomas to the wall where Mickey's name was carved. Sarah joined them, carrying the folded flag. Together, they stood before the polished surface, 3 generations connected by service, sacrifice, and love. Thomas reached out, his weathered fingers tracing the letters of Mickey's name. The stone felt warm under his touch, alive with memory and meaning. Captain Hayes's wings gleamed on his lapel, a reminder of the unexpected brotherhood that had helped bring him to this moment. Mickey, he whispered, too softly for anyone but Sarah to hear, I made it, brother. I kept my promise. His hand lingered on the carved letters, bridging the gap between past and present, between the young soldier who had dragged him to safety and the troubled soul who had finally found peace. The ceremony continued around them, but for Thomas and Sarah, time seemed to pause in that sacred space before Mickey's name. The afternoon sun painted the sky in shades of gold and purple, casting a gentle light across the memorial wall, making each name shine like a beacon of remembrance. From somewhere in the crowd, a voice began singing, Amazing Grace. Others joined in, the melody swelling across the plaza, carrying with it the weight of memory and the promise of healing. Thomas stood straighter, feeling Mickey's presence in every note, in every carved name, in every tear that fell on sacred ground. The businessman who had helped him make this journey stepped forward quietly, placing a single white rose at the base of the wall. Others followed, creating a growing tribute of flowers and small mementos, each one representing a story, a memory, a life touched by sacrifice and service. As the sun began its final descent toward the horizon, Thomas Anderson stood at attention one last time, offering a crisp salute to his fallen brother. The captain's wings caught the fading light, and Mickey's photograph rested safe against his heart, while above them, carved in eternal stone, the name of Michael Mickey Reynolds stood as testament to a promise kept and a brotherhood that transcended a death itself. After the ceremony, a small group gathered at a nearby Veterans Hall, a modest building with flags flying proudly out front. Thomas sat at a table with Sarah, surrounded by photographs and mementos she had brought to share. The folded flag from Captain Hayes rested between them, a bridge connecting their shared memories of Mickey. "This was his favorite," Sarah said softly, sliding a worn baseball card across the table. "He kept it in his wallet always, even during his darkest days. Said it reminded him of better times, of Sunday afternoons, listening to games on the radio with his own father." Thomas picked up the card carefully, noting the creases that spoke of years of handling. The businessman from the flight, who had introduced himself as James Bennett, sat quietly nearby, listening as Sarah shared stories of Mickey as a father. The good days when he would make pancakes in funny shapes, the harder days when memories of Vietnam kept him locked in his room. Each story added another layer to Thomas's understanding of his old friend. "Your father," Thomas said, choosing his words carefully. "He wrote to me once, about 10 years after we came home, said he was trying to get better, trying to find his way back." He paused, remembering the letter that had arrived unexpectedly one spring morning. He wanted me to know that saving my life had given him something to hold on to during the rough nights. Sarah nodded, wiping away tears. "That sounds like Dad. He could never accept being called a hero, but he held on to the fact that he'd helped others. It was the one bright spot in all his darkness." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, leather-bound journal. "I found this after he was gone. I think you should have it." Thomas accepted the journal with trembling hands. The leather was soft with age, the pages yellowed and dog-eared. Opening it carefully, he recognized Mickey's distinctive handwriting, the same cramped style that had marked maps and radio logs in Vietnam. "He wrote about you," Sarah continued, "about the day he pulled you out of that jungle, about how your friendship helped him hold onto his humanity during the worst of the war." She touched the journal gently. "But he also wrote about the battles he fought after coming home, the ones he couldn't win alone." The afternoon light filtered through the hall's windows, casting warm patterns across the table where memories were being shared and wounds gently tended. Other veterans moved quietly through the room, some stopping to offer quiet words of support or share their own stories of battles fought far from any battlefield. Jennifer, the flight attendant who had served on their flight from Boston, appeared. In the doorway, she had changed out of her uniform, but still carried herself with the same gentle grace. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said softly. "Captain Hayes asked me to bring this." She placed a small box on the table. Inside was a set of pilot's wings, identical to the ones Thomas wore on his lapel, but these were mounted on a simple wooden plaque. A small brass plate beneath them read, "In honor of Michael Mickey Reynolds, who never left a brother behind." Thomas ran his fingers across the engraved words, remembering Mickey's voice crackling over the radio, calling in coordinates, cracking jokes to keep their spirits up during long patrols. The memories were as clear as yesterday, untouched by the decades that had passed. "Would you tell me about him?" Sarah asked quietly. "About the Mickey you knew in Vietnam? Sometimes I think I only knew the after, never the before." Her eyes held a mixture of hope and hesitation, as if unsure whether the stories would bring comfort or pain. Thomas straightened in his chair, Mickey's journal resting under his hand. "Your father was the bravest man I ever knew," he began. "Not just because he saved my life, but because he saved all our souls a little bit every day." The words came easier now, flowing like a river long dammed, finally finding its path to the sea. He told her about Mickey's jokes during monsoon season, about how he would sing Elvis songs off-key during night watch, about the way he knew exactly when someone needed a word of encouragement or a moment of silence. With each story, Sarah's face softened, as if finally seeing a complete picture of the father she had known only in fragments. The afternoon deepened into evening, and still the stories continued. Other veterans drifted closer, adding their own memories their own understanding of the battles fought both in war and in peace. The small Veterans Hall became a sanctuary where grief could be shared, where healing could begin, where promises made long ago could finally find their fulfillment. Outside, the American flag caught the last rays of sunlight, its colors bright against the darkening sky. Inside, surrounded by memories and understanding, Thomas Anderson continued to honor his friend, one story at a time, while Mickey's daughter listened, finally knowing the full measure of her father's courage, sacrifice, and love. The evening was drawing to a close at the Veterans Hall when Colonel Martinez approached Thomas and Sarah's table. "Staff Sergeant Anderson," he said quietly, "there's someone else who would like to speak with you." He gestured toward the entrance, where an elderly man in a wheelchair was being guided by a nurse. Thomas's breath caught in his throat as recognition dawned. Despite the years and the obvious toll of age, he would know that face anywhere. "Doc Williams," he whispered, rising slowly from his chair. The man who had served as their combat medic in Vietnam, who had patched them up countless times, who had worked alongside Mickey to save so many lives, was here. Sarah watched with quiet, understanding as Thomas made his way across the room. The former medic's eyes lit up with recognition, and tears began to flow freely down his weathered cheeks. "Anderson," he said, his voice trembling but clear. "When I heard about Mickey's ceremony, I had to come, had to be here." The two men embraced, decades of shared experiences flowing between them without need for words. When they finally separated, Doc Williams reached into a bag attached to his wheelchair and pulled out a battered medical kit. "Still have this," he said. "The same one. From that day, the day Mickey brought you in." Thomas sank into a chair beside the wheelchair, while Sarah drew closer, eager to hear another perspective on her father's story. The medical kit lay open between them, its contents still neatly organized despite years of use and wear. "Your father," Doc Williams said, turning to Sarah, "he wouldn't leave Anderson behind that day. Carried him through sniper fire, through a damn minefield. Kept talking to him the whole time, keeping him conscious. When they finally reached our position, Mickey was exhausted, bleeding from where bullets had grazed him, but he just kept saying, 'Fix him up, Doc. Just fix him up.'" The old medic's hands traced the outlines of his medical kit as he spoke. "I patched up countless soldiers during my tour, but I never forgot that day. Mickey Reynolds showed us all what it meant to be a brother. In arms. He didn't just save Anderson's life, he reminded us of our humanity in a place where it was easy to lose it." James Bennett, who had remained quietly supportive throughout the day, approached with fresh coffee for everyone. As he distributed the cups, Doc Williams continued his story. "After the war, I tried to keep track of everyone from our unit, lost touch with Mickey for a while, but then he found me. Called me late one night, about 15 years ago." Thomas leaned forward, recognizing the timeline. It would have been shortly before Mickey's final battle. Doc Williams's voice grew softer, heavy with memory. He wanted to talk about that day, about all the days in Vietnam. Said he was trying to make peace with it all. I thought he was getting better. Sarah reached out and took the old medic's hand. "He was trying," she said softly. In his own way, he was always trying. She shared a look with Thomas, both understanding the complex journey Mickey had traveled. Jennifer, who had stayed to help at the hall, began quietly collecting empty coffee cups and plates. The evening was growing late, but no one seemed ready to leave. The space had become sacred, a temple of memories and healing. "I brought something else," Doc Williams said, reaching again into his bag. He withdrew a small, tarnished medal. "This was Mickey's. He gave it to me that night we talked, said he didn't deserve it. I've been carrying it ever since, waiting for the right moment to pass it on." He held the medal out to Sarah. "I think he'd want you to have it now." As Sarah cradled the medal, Thomas pulled out the photograph of Charlie Company. He showed it to Doc Williams, who pointed out faces and shared stories about each man. The evening deepened around them as memories flowed freely, tears and laughter mingling in the quiet space. Colonel Martinez returned with an announcement that surprised everyone. The Secretary of Veterans Affairs heard about today's ceremony. He said, "They're establishing a new program inspired by Mickey's story. It's going to focus on helping veterans who are struggling after coming home, creating a network of support and understanding." The news rippled through the room. Mickey's legacy would live on, not just in memories and carved stone, but in real help for others fighting the same battles he had faced. Sarah's tears flowed freely now, but her smile was radiant. "They're calling it Reynolds Watch," the colonel continued, "because Mickey never stopped watching out for his brothers, even when he was fighting his own battles." Thomas felt the weight of Captain Hayes's wings on his lapel, thought of the unexpected kindness that had carried him from Boston to Chicago, remembered Mickey's voice crackling over a radio in a distant jungle. All of it connected, all of it, part of a larger story of brotherhood, sacrifice, and hope. The businessman who had started the chain of generosity at Logan International stood up. "I'd like to make a donation to the program," he announced, "in memory of Mickey Reynolds and my father and all those who fought battles both abroad and at home." Others in the room began to step forward, offering support, sharing stories, creating connections. The Veterans Hall hummed with purpose and possibility as Mickey's story began to ripple outward, touching more lives, creating more hope. Doc Williams reached for Thomas's hand. "You kept your promise, Anderson," he said softly. "You made it. Here for Mickey. But more than that, you've helped ensure his story will help others. That's what he would have wanted." As the evening drew to a close, Thomas stood with Sarah outside the Veterans Hall. The stars were bright in the Chicago sky, and a gentle breeze carried the first hints of autumn. Mickey's journal was tucked safely in Sarah's bag, the medal from Doc Williams secure in her pocket, and the folded flag from Captain Hayes held carefully in her arms. "Thank you," she said simply, embracing the man who had traveled so far to honor her father, "not just for coming today, but for helping me understand who he really was. All of him, not just the broken pieces I knew." Thomas touched the wings on his lapel, thinking of the extraordinary journey that had brought him here. "Mickey saved more than my life that day in Vietnam," he replied. "He showed us all what it means to never leave a brother behind. And today, all these years later, his example is still saving lives." They looked up at the stars together, a father's daughter and his closest friend, united in memory and purpose. Somewhere, Thomas thought, Mickey was watching, finally at peace, knowing that his struggle would help light the way for others fighting similar battles. The flag snapped gently in the evening breeze, and the lights of Chicago gleamed like stars fallen to earth. In the distance, a bugle began to play taps one final time, its notes carrying across the city. A lullaby for warriors finally at rest, a promise of peace for those still fighting, and a reminder that no soldier ever truly walks alone. The autumn wind blew gently across Logan International Airport a week after the ceremony as Sarah Mitchell approached Gate 17 for her morning shift. The terminal looked the same as it had that transformative morning when Thomas Anderson had first appeared with his outdated boarding pass, yet something fundamental had changed. News of what had transpired in Chicago had spread through the airport community like wildfire. The story of the veteran who had traveled to honor his fallen brother and the spontaneous outpouring of support that had made it possible had touched hearts across the nation. But here at Gate 17, where it had all begun, the impact was especially profound. Sarah noticed it in the small things first. Veterans passing through would often pause at the gate, some leaving small tokens, a set of wings, a medal, a photograph. A simple plaque had appeared on the wall. From this gate a promise was kept, in memory of Michael "Mickey" Reynolds and all those who fought battles both abroad and at home. James Bennett, the businessman who had first offered to help Thomas, had become a regular presence at Logan. His morning flights to Chicago now departed from Gate 17 by his specific request. Each time he passed through, he would pause to speak with Sarah, sharing updates about the growing impact of Reynolds' watch. This morning, he approached the counter with his usual quiet dignity, but there was an extra brightness in his eyes. "Good morning, Sarah," he said, placing his briefcase down. "I thought you'd want to know. Reynolds' watch has been officially recognized by the Department of Veterans Affairs. They're implementing the program nationwide." Sarah smiled, remembering Thomas's trembling hands holding that outdated boarding pass. "How many veterans have they helped so far?" "Over 200 in just the first week," James replied, his voice thick with emotion. "They're calling it the Gate 17 initiative, creating a network of airport personnel trained to recognize veterans in distress, ensuring they never have to travel alone when they're hurting." The morning sun streamed through the terminal windows, catching the new plaque and making it shine. Outside, aircraft moved across the tarmac in their eternal dance, each carrying stories, promises, and possibilities into the sky. "There's more," James continued, pulling an envelope from his briefcase. "Captain Hayes has been promoted to Director of Veteran Services for the airline. He's implementing a program to provide free flights for veterans traveling to memorial services or seeking mental health support." Sarah took the envelope, opening it carefully. Inside was a photograph taken at the Chicago ceremony. Thomas and Sarah Reynolds, standing before Mickey's name on the memorial wall, the folded flag between them, Captain Hayes's wings gleaming on Thomas's lapel. "They're calling it Mickey's wings," James explained. "Every major airline has joined the initiative. No veteran will ever be turned away from a gate again when they're trying to honor a fallen brother or seeking help." The morning announcements echoed through the terminal, but at Gate 17, time seemed to move at its own pace. Sarah pinned the photograph to the bulletin board behind her counter, next to the growing collection of military patches, medals, and notes left by passing service members. "Have you heard from Thomas?" James asked, checking his watch but making no move to board his flight just yet. Sarah nodded, reaching for another envelope beneath her counter. "He wrote to all of us who were there that morning. Here." She handed him a letter, the handwriting steady and clear despite the emotion it carried. James read aloud softly, "What happened at Gate 17 wasn't just about getting me to Chicago. It was about remembering that we're all connected, all responsible for each other. Mickey taught me that in Vietnam, and last week all of you reminded me that his lesson still holds true. Every gate can be a gateway to healing, every journey, an opportunity to honor those who fought battles we couldn't see." The first passengers began approaching the gate for boarding, but they moved with unusual gentleness, many pausing to read the plaque or study the growing memorial wall. A young soldier in uniform stopped to salute the photograph of Thomas and Sarah Reynolds before continuing to his flight. "There's something else," Sarah said, her voice catching slightly. "Doc Williams called yesterday. He's been working with the VA to establish trauma support centers in major airports. The first one opens next month, right here at Logan. They're naming it after Mickey." James nodded, understanding the significance. "A place where veterans can find help before it's too late, where the battles they fight after coming home can be acknowledged and supported." The morning light grew stronger, filling Gate 17 with a warm glow. Sarah remembered Thomas's words about Mickey being their light in the darkness, about how some battles continue long after the war ends, about the importance of never leaving anyone behind. "Captain Hayes sent this," she continued, showing James another photograph. This one showed the captain's office in Chicago, where the original set of wings he'd given Thomas now hung in a place of honor. Beneath them was a simple inscription, "For Mickey who showed us the way home." More passengers gathered at the gate, but the usual rush and tension of morning departures was noticeably absent. Instead, there was a sense of reverence, of understanding, that they stood on ground that had become sacred through one act of collective kindness. A group of veterans, easily recognizable by their bearing despite their civilian clothes, approached the counter. The leader, a woman with sergeant's stripes, tattooed on her arm, spoke softly to Sarah. "We heard about what happened here, about Mickey's story. We're heading to a reunion in San Diego, and we wanted to leave something." She placed a folded flag on the counter, similar to the one Captain Hayes had given Thomas. "This flew over our base in Afghanistan. We'd like it to stay here, at Gate 17, to remind everyone that no warrior should ever stand alone." Sarah accepted the flag with trembling hands, adding it to the growing memorial. James stepped back, watching as more passengers joined the impromptu ceremony, many sharing their own connections to service, to loss, to the ongoing battles fought in silence. "You know," he said quietly, "I've been flying through this airport for 20 years. Never knew my father's struggle with his war memories was something shared by so many others. Mickey's story, Thomas's journey, they've opened so many eyes, including mine." Sarah checked the time. Boarding should have started 5 minutes ago, but somehow that didn't seem to matter as much anymore. Not here, not at Gate 17, where time moved according to the rhythm of healing and remembrance. A young woman approached the counter, holding a small child in her arms. "My husband's deployed right now," she said softly. "When he comes home, if he needs help, will there be people here who understand?" "Yes," Sarah replied firmly, thinking of Thomas, of Mickey, of all the stories that had converged at this gate. There will always be someone here who understands. The morning continued to unfold, passengers finally beginning to board, but something had fundamentally shifted. Gate 17 had become more than just another departure point. It was now a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in our most isolated moments, help can appear in unexpected forms. James finally picked up his briefcase, preparing to board. "You know," he said, pausing at the counter, "my father never talked about his war experiences. After he passed, I found his journals, realized how much he had struggled alone. But because of what happened here, because of Mickey's story, other veterans won't have to fight those battles in silence anymore." Sarah touched the plaque on the wall, thinking of Thomas Anderson's journey, of Mickey Reynolds's sacrifice, of the countless veterans who had passed through this gate in the week since the ceremony, each leaving a piece of their own story behind. "Gate 17 is more than a memorial now," she said. "It's a promise, just like the one Thomas kept for Mickey. A promise that no one has to travel their darkest paths alone." The final boarding call echoed through the terminal, but at Gate 17, the morning sun continued to shine on the growing collection of memories, medals, and promises kept. Outside, aircraft rose into the autumn sky, carrying with them the story of a veteran's journey, a friend's sacrifice, and the enduring power of brotherhood that had transformed a simple airport gate into sacred ground. Thomas's letter to Sarah concluded with words that now hung, framed, beside the Gate 17 plaque. "Mickey taught us that the greatest battles are often fought in silence, and the greatest courage lies in reaching out to those still fighting. Every gate can be a gateway to healing, every journey an opportunity to honor those who showed us the way home. We are all, in our own ways, keeping promises made long ago in distant lands, carrying forward the light of brotherhood that Mickey and countless others kept burning through their darkest hours. Let Gate 17 stand as a reminder that no warrior ever truly walks alone, that help can appear in the most unexpected places, and that some promises, kept in love and honor, can change the world one heart at a time." The morning sun reached its zenith, bathing Gate 17 in golden light. Sarah Mitchell stood at her post, watching as another day unfolded, knowing that each passenger who passed through now carried with them a piece of Mickey's story, of Thomas's journey, of the enduring power of promises kept and brotherhood honored. The terminal hummed with its usual activity, but here, at this gate, time moved to the rhythm of healing, remembrance, and hope. An eternal testament to the warrior who never left a brother behind, and the promise that transformed an airport. Gate into holy ground, the legacy of Gate 17 continued to grow with each passing month. The story of Thomas Anderson's journey to honor Mickey Reynolds became more than just a memory. It became a beacon of hope for veterans across the nation. The Gate 17 initiative spread to airports throughout the country, creating a network of support that caught countless warriors before they fell too deep into their private battles. Sarah Mitchell remained at her post, watching over the gate that had become sacred ground. Each morning, she would straighten the medals, adjust the flags, and ensure that Mickey's story remained alive for all who passed through. The photograph of Thomas and Sarah Reynolds before the memorial wall served as a constant reminder of promises kept and brotherhood honored. Thomas Anderson's final letter to the gate became a mantra for airport staff nationwide. Every gate can be a gateway to healing. Captain Hayes's wings, given in a moment of understanding, inspired a movement that transformed how airlines approached veterans in distress. Mickey Reynolds' legacy lived on, not just in carved stone or folded flags, but in the lives saved through the program that bore his name. His daughter Sarah became an advocate for veteran mental health, sharing her father's story to help others understand the battles that don't end when the war does. And at Logan International, Gate 17 stood as a testament to the power of human kindness, to the bonds forged in combat that never break, and to the enduring truth that no warrior should ever have to stand alone. Each sunrise brought new stories, new healing, new hope, all because one veteran refused to let his brother's memory fade, and a group of strangers chose to help him keep his promise. The gate remained, as it would always remain, a sacred space, where past and present met, where promises were kept, and where Mickey's light continued to guide others home.